now.
Hello together, and welcome back to another conversation with Christoffer Døhlen. So today we decided to talk about abortion because this is, of course, still a currently discussed topic. How should we as a society handle abortion? Should it be legal and not legal, and under which circumstances? And it's also a very interesting philosophical topic because it opens up the space for many philosophical questions, like what exactly is a human being, or is there a soul, or how can you differentiate between a human and just a bunch of cells? Or yes, there are many important philosophical questions that this touches upon. And so yes, please just tell the audience your initial thoughts on this entire topic.
Yes, thank you, Amos. Right, so abortion is a very controversial political issue today, and it has been for quite some time. And I would say that it is not an issue which someone can be just indifferent to. It seems to be a very important issue, because it seems to me that the relevant question when it comes to the whole issue of abortion is whether abortion is intentional, is the intentional murder of an innocent human being. Because if abortion truly is, because if the unborn is a human being with the right to life, then abortion would be gravely immoral, because then it is intentionally taking the life of an innocent human being. But if it's not a human being, then of course it is a bit different when it comes to the gravity of the immorality of abortion. So I think that the question of whether abortion is an attack on the right to life or not, I think that is very important question, because we as a society, we know that taking someone's life is a very serious crime if you intentionally take the life of an innocent human being. So if the unborn is an innocent human being and has the right to life, then of course abortion becomes a very serious issue. So that's why the question itself is something that people need to deal with. It's not simply something people can be very indifferent to. And that's why I would say that some of the, let's say, questions or objections when it comes to abortion, for instance, some people argue that, well, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I don't have a right to impose my values upon women or something. That seems to be a very common liberal way of thinking about abortion. But if abortion is an attack on the right to life, then that becomes objectively an immoral thing. It's not like you can be sort of personally against murder, but wanting the state to legalize murder because you don't want to impose your values upon someone else. Obviously, murder is bad and should be prohibited, not simply a personal preference. So that's why I would say that it boils down, politically speaking, boils down to the more philosophical question of what is the unborn? Is the unborn a human being with the right to life, or is it not a human being with the right to life? That's sort of what it boils down to. And how you think of this question has huge implications, I would say. So that's my initial considerations on this issue.
Yes, thank you for these considerations. I think you are just going in the right direction, which is this question: is the embryo or the fetus or just the egg that has conceived a sperm, is this a human being, or is it not yet a human being? And if so, at what stage does it start to become a human being? And this is a very complicated question, because on the one hand, there are the people who are more just how do you say, very no exceptions. They just say, well, it is a human being from the second that this egg cell of the woman is fertilized with the sperm or has connected with the sperm, then it's a human being. But of course, the other party then replies, well, it doesn't really look like a human being. It's just a cell, or maybe 10 cells, or maybe 100 cells. So, but I think, as you rightly pointed out, this is the fundamental ethical question here, because if you think that it actually is a human being, then ending this human being's life is somehow in the same category as murder. And you, just because the embryo cannot speak out for himself doesn't really mean that it's not murder, if you believe that it is a human being. Because there are other cases where maybe someone has no relatives or no friends, so nobody would speak out for him, but that still doesn't mean that you are allowed to kill them. And so, yes, I think it's a very difficult question. And there is also the problem that if you say, if you start defining certain characteristics that have to be given for something with human DNA to be considered as a human, then you directly get into the problem of the slippery slope argument. And of course, the slippery slope argument is problematic because you can use it for every argument, but still it is a problem if you take the sanctity of life, that a human life has an innate value just because it is a human life, which is a very fundamental value of our society, and you start making exceptions to this, then somebody can, of course, ask, well, if we start making exceptions, how do we define where we have to stop making exceptions? So then some people might say, well, severely disabled people or very old people that are no longer conscious because they have Alzheimer's, it's okay to kill them too because they have no consciousness. So we get into all kinds of trouble there. So this is just a couple of my thoughts to your initial statement.
Right, yes, and I think I would sort of emphasize the centrality of this question, whether abortion is the murder of an innocent human being or not, because you could sort of put the argument against abortion in a very basic syllogism and very basic argument that premise one, murder should be prohibited. Premise two, abortion is murder, therefore abortion should be prohibited. Now, of course, the disputed question is about whether abortion is murder or not. Of course, that's what people might discuss. But if we accept that the unborn is an innocent human being with a right to life, then I think it inevitably follows that the state should ban it, because, of course, it's obvious to everyone that the state should ban murder against born people. And you could sort of, and when it comes to all these scenarios about, well, what about mothers who were unfortunately raped and got pregnant because of this? And what about the mothers who cannot take care of the children because they don't have enough money? And all these scenarios, which are, of course, very, very tough and difficult situations, no doubt about that. But if I would say that if abortion is murder, then the gravity of taking someone's life and of an innocent human being is so grave that those factors cannot justify them, just as we couldn't justify the killings of born human beings by those same reasons. Under no circumstances is it right to kill a child. Of course, that's obviously wrong, regardless of those factors which might be involved in the mother's situation and all that. So yes, the centrality of that question about whether it is murder or not, I think that's the very basic thing. And if you accept that it is murder, then you sort of have to take out the implications of that, the logical implications. And of course, then the question becomes, well, when do you have the right to life and personhood and all of that, which is sort of more related to the question about whether it is murder or not. And I agree with you, when you sort of begin to have very arbitrary limits or arbitrary criteria for when when someone has the right to life or not, then you have very dangerous consequences. Like, for instance, you begin to say that, well, what about very old people who are going to die soon? What about some people living with pain or stuff like that? And you have famous philosophers like Peter Singer, who has flirted with the idea of infanticide, that you can actually, I think he has argued that you can actually, under some circumstances, kill infants. And because of his understanding of the right to life and all of that. So yes, I think how we understand personhood, how we understand the right to life is so crucial, because if we get that wrong, then we risk doing seriously criminal moral actions. So yeah, that's what I would comment on that, yes.
Yes, interesting. So I have to make also a couple of comments. The first is that ethics is very difficult. So you said before that under no circumstances is it okay to murder a child that was born. And so I just happened to have read about a couple of Jews who were hiding in Poland, and they were hiding in the sewer system. And they had like some Polish sewer worker who brought them food and helped them stay in hiding down there. And they were hiding for 1.5 years, I think, or something like that, in the sewer. And so at one point, one of these women gave birth to a baby, and she instantly, as it was born, they just strangled the baby so that it wouldn't scream and wouldn't give them all away. And so this is, of course, very tragic, but I'm not sure if I would say that under these circumstances, this was a crime, because you have to maybe sacrifice one life to save 10. So it can be difficult. That's just as a side note. But then there is, of course, also an argument that we will have to consider in this discussion, which is maybe the argument from radical individualism. Like, because of course, it's not just a human, the baby is not just a human like every other human, but it's a human that lives inside of the body of another human, namely the mother. And so some people who defend a very strong individualistic stance, they say the woman has a right to decide over her own body. And so though we might agree that it is wrong to murder any human life outside of someone else's body, it's perhaps a more difficult question when the life is inside of some other person's body, because you also have the right to decide over your own body. So I'm not sure what I think about this, but I think we need to consider it. Yes, and also just another thing we might have to consider, that as I said, it's not obvious that a cell or a bunch of cells, like 5 or 10 or 100, have the same right or status as a human. So I don't know how we can, if there is a distinction, if we can make one, but at least we have to address this in this question of whether it is in fact, as you said, the killing of an innocent human or something else.
Right. Yes. Yeah. To first point about what about some very, very exceptional grave circumstances when sort of you kill a person because the alternative is that the person is going to be killed in a very short amount of time and in a much worse way, and all those very, very extreme, exceptional circumstances. And of course, there might be some debate about those, and of course, there is a discussion about, well, what about God's right to take life? Because of course, you have the things in Christianity about, well, what about some of the actions God did in the Old Testament toward people and all of that. So we also have some, you could say, discussion about what about can God take life and all that. So there is of course some debate there. But I would sort of say that under at least under the circumstances that usually people bring up to justify abortion, like for instance a woman that was raped, or that she's very, very poor, or something like that, which is the usual justifications for abortion. I don't think any reasonable person would be defending the murder of born people on those same grounds, like for instance rape and poverty. So at least those things cannot sufficiently justify murder on unborn people, and therefore if the unborn are also people with rights, then it follows that it cannot justify abortion either. So yes, that goes back to the centrality of that question. So it could be therefore you could say what's the word, useful to compare, okay, the killing of an unborn human being in an abortion, if it is a human being, compare that with killing a born human being and see, well, if it justifies abortion, can it justify the killing of a born person in the same way? And therefore compare, okay, what's the relevant difference there? And I think the relevant difference is whether the unborn is a human being or not. And so yes, and yes, you brought up the question of what makes a human being or a person with the right to life and all that, because some would say that, well, the unborn are an organism, but they are still technically speaking just a group of cells combined together. But of course you might also point out that we are also a bunch of cells combined together, you and I right now, but still we have the right to life. So I would sort of perhaps go back to the classical Aristotelian notion of matter and form, that of course, yes, you could say that we are made up of matter, and in another sense we are made up of atoms, but still we have this existence as human beings. We have this human nature or human essence, because yes, we have the matter, but the matter is also combined in a certain way to create a whole organism, which has an existence in its totality. And I would say that you can also say that about a human organism that is conceived in the mother's womb, because then it's no longer simply a piece of the woman's body, but it's a living, unique organism with a unique genetic code, which has the potential to develop on its own and not simply as some sort of thing attached to the mother. Or you, of course, you could say that the unborn is attached to the mother, but not in a sense that it is a part of the mother's body, but rather it is an organism in and of itself that develops on its own, that is living, and that has all the potentials of a human being to further grow into a more mature human being. So I would say that it seems reasonable to me to say that from conception onwards, we have a human organism on its own that we can reasonably call a human being, and it seems like the science of embryology confirms this. And therefore, to sort of put a limit that, for instance, oh no, after this amount of weeks, then it has the right to life, it seems to me to be a bit arbitrary. It seems that the right to life is grounded in your human nature or your human essence. And if your human nature is already there from conception onwards, then it seems to me that you are a human being with a right to life from conception and onwards. So that's the basic view I have on the matter.
Yes, I just wanted to say, of course, I agree with your statement that under the circumstances that people usually bring up to justify abortion, these wouldn't justify the murder of a born child. I was just struck by the use of the word never, so that triggered the philosopher in me. So, but of course, under these circumstances, I absolutely agree with you. And I also like your bringing up Aristotle and the idea of matter and form. And of course, it is absolutely true. As you said, you and I are also just a bunch of cells, if you so want, with maybe a little bit bone and some teeth in there as well. But so it doesn't solve the question. And so in one lecture, we we talked about the Aristotelian notion of the soul, and for Aristotle, the soul was something like the form of a human being. So there is the matter that is like the flesh and the bones that makes up my body. And then there is the form, and form is not just form like geometrical form, but it's more like function or principle. And so you could, from that point of view, see the soul of a human being like the life force or life principle that this human has the potential to actualize this form in reality. And of course, strives also towards doing this. And this goes to an important point, which is if you just leave the embryo alone, then it will eventually turn into a human being. So this form or life force or life principle is actually there, and it is at work, and it is growing and developing. And so from that point of view, it seems difficult to me to justify intervening in this process. So that's an important point. On the other hand, you mentioned that it seems arbitrary to define a certain number of weeks after which a fertilized egg is now seen as a human being or as a fetus, which is like a small baby inside of a womb. But we use, of course, similar arbitrary criteria in other instances, especially in legal questions all the time. So for example, we say in most countries that a human being becomes an adult at the age of 18. Now, why exactly 18? Why not 17 and a half or 19? This is, of course, in some sense, an arbitrary limit where we say, well, at this age, most human beings with their, like with the average growth and maturation rate have reached a certain level of independence and of critical thinking so that we can give them the full responsibility of what we consider an adult. Of course, some people reached that stage at 16, and some people maybe reach it at 30, and some people maybe never reach it. So, but still, legally speaking, we draw a clear and measurable distinction. So, yes, what do you think of these two? Well, so yes, and so what I'm trying to say is perhaps it is not entirely unjustified to do the same thing when asking at what point does a fertilized egg become a human? So what do you think of these two things?
Right. So yes, I suppose in the specific issue about defining adulthood at the age of 18. Now, some people might perhaps argue that, well, we shouldn't define it in this arbitrary way, and rather that adulthood should be defined on an individual case-by-case basis. But I'm not prepared to make that argument right now, but that might be a discussion that some people are having. But yes, I agree in general that at least there are several situations where we simply have to make an arbitrary rule about what is inside and outside of this specific category. And I would say in those contexts, we simply have no choice but to choose an arbitrary rule. We have no other way to solve a specific problem. We are simply trapped with this thing in front of us. But on the other hand, with the issue of defining the right to life, I think we don't need to have an arbitrary rule here. I think we have a very natural rule to define human life at conception, and therefore, since it seems reasonable to ground the right to life in human nature, it seems therefore to me reasonable and natural to define the right to life from conception onwards, because here we have a very unique you could say conception of something new, a new organism, a new genetic code, which is fundamentally different from the egg and the sperm that was before. So I would say that yes, of course, in general, there are many situations where we simply have to choose an arbitrary rule because we have no other choice. But in a specific context of the embryo, I think we here don't need to do that. I think we have a very natural rule or criteria to set there based on conception and the formation of a new human organism. So that's sort of how I would answer that question. And it seems to me also that I'm of course not an expert in embryology, but it seems to me from what I've seen that embryology thinks that, or embryologists think that, yes, it is something fundamentally new at conception. There is a new human organism with a unique human nature and genetic code. So therefore, I would say that to define the right to life from that point of conception onwards seems to be natural and scientific. And that's how I would sort of respond to that, yes.
Interesting. Because I see your point that you say this new human organism comes into existence at the point of conception. That's when its genetic code basically for the first time comes to existence in this combination. And from then on, it starts to develop. So I have not really much to say against this. And also from the point of view of the Aristotelian definition of form, of soul as the life force or life principle, or the potential form that you can bring into reality through your life, this is also present at conception, because this is the genetic code plays a defining part in this. So there comes a couple of more questions into my mind. So one is, of course, there is this pill that you can take after you had sex, I think up to 3 days, and it stops the embryo from, what's the word, like nesting inside of the uterus. And so even though the egg cell might have been conceived, then it cannot nest in the uterus and it dies and falls out. So is this, in some sense, it still seems a bit difficult for me to define this as the same act as shooting a person or stabbing them or killing a full human person. But maybe that's just my problem, but I find it somehow difficult.
Right, yes. Well, it seems to me that since that pill, if it was a pill that you talked about, actually does this and directly results in the embryo dying, then it seems to be some sort of murder if we are committed to the view that from conception onwards it is a human being with the right to life. Now, you could point out that there is a technical difference in that abortion is more like going directly into the human organism, the unborn itself, and destroying it, like dismembering the body. But while with a pill, you sort of just have that you close the uterus from having the embryo attached to it, and therefore it dies on its own. So you can say technically it is a less direct and less brutal form of taking the life of that embryo. But still, I would argue that it is immoral to use that pill, though you could say, yes, there is a technical difference in how direct the attack on the life is in practice there. And yes, of course, I would sort of, when it comes to the whole issue of contraception, I would, of course, some people say that, well, let's say that you use contraception during sexual acts. Is that as bad as abortion? But of course, I would point out that no, because contraception, with the exception of that pill you mentioned, usually just hinders conception from taking place. It's not like it attacks what is conceived afterward. It simply prevents the formation of a human being in the first place, and therefore it cannot be seen as murder because there is not an actual human being there yet. There is simply potential matter. So that's why the objection that, well, is all contraception just abortion? It doesn't work, because you have to distinguish between potentiality and actuality in that regard. Of course, I would say that contraception, artificial contraception, is immoral, because that comes back to the question of teleology and the purpose of sexual acts and all of that. But it's different from killing the unborn, which is, you could say, a far more serious moral matter. Though I think both are immoral. So that's just something I would reflect upon when it comes to that issue.
Yes, so I agree with you that it's not the same thing to use contraception or to, as you said, you are just hindering a human life from forming, but there is no human there yet, so it's a different question. I wouldn't, however, agree with your notion that the use of contraception is immoral, but perhaps that's a question we can discuss in another video. It would also be interesting. I was just thinking before, as I finished my sentence, that maybe it's just like a very, very small murder. So of course, if you have a human being and he is the size of one cell, which is like microscopically small, and then you just take a pill that hinders this fertilized egg from attaching, then it's just like a microscopically small murder. Of course, it's less how do you say, spectacular than killing a full-grown human adult, which makes usually a big mess and a big effect. So, but you could argue that it is in the same category of action, just on a very different scale. But I'm not sure if I would say this, but you could certainly argue this. Yes.
Right, yes, I would sort of say that, of course, there are differences between taking the life of a very, very small embryo and a sort of full-grown human being, for instance, because you could say that the full-grown human being has a much later state of development. So there is, of course, many differences between those. But I would still say that since both of them share in the same human nature, they therefore have the same human dignity. And I would therefore say that human dignity is not dependent upon the stage of development. Both murders are grave in that they are still attacking the same kind of human dignity. So yes, you could say that there are, of course, differences in the human beings, in size, in development, and all that, but they are still attacking the same dignity, and therefore they are both grave murders. That's what I suppose I would answer when it comes to that. So yes, there is the question of human dignity, and therefore I would say that human dignity is grounded in human nature, and embryos have the same human essence as full-grown human beings, though there are different degrees of development, but we have to make distinctions there. So that's sort of my approach to that, yes.
Okay, interesting question at this point comes to my mind. So let's say that I agree with this statement, that the human dignity comes from having a human nature, and in that sense, it is technically, you are ending another human being's life, and you are acting to end this life, and in that sense, it is wrong to do this, to do an abortion. Now, many questions still come up in my mind. So one question is, like comparing different evils against each other. So, because you can, of course, say this is more of a very deontological perspective, that the duty to do the right thing is independent of any considerations outside. It's just murder is murder, and thus it is wrong. But now I somehow also think that in reality, many things are not, it's not so easy. So for example, if let's say we ban abortion as it was for some time, and then maybe you have some woman going to some doctor illegally who will do it anyways, and it will not be done properly. Or just maybe you have also still, we haven't addressed this question that the body of the woman is actually also, this is also a human being who has technically also, in some sense, a right to control over their own body. Now you can of course say, well, you know what you knowingly had sex, and so you got pregnant and you knew that this can happen, so you made the choice and now you have to live with the consequences. But still, to my mind, there are just still some questions there, like how to prioritize all of this one against the other. Yes.
Right. So yeah, I would sort of also point out that, of course, though abortion is murder and should be banned, of course, we shouldn't forget that there are, of course, mothers who are in a very, very tough and difficult situation, and they should be treated compassionately. For instance, victims of rape should be, of course, treated very compassionately, and we should help them. And of course, projects, for instance, we're doing with adoption and things like that are super great when it comes to sort of helping out or offering help. But I would sort of still say that, well, despite this, we cannot justify, even though they are very difficult situation, they cannot justify the taking of an innocent human life still. And of course you could go back to the whole comparison. Well, would it be okay if we had the same scenario but with a born, for instance, toddler, born child instead of an unborn child? Would we justify that in that scenario? I think most people would say that no, that wouldn't be justified, and therefore it cannot be justified when it comes to abortion either. Now, of course, you bring up the argument about if you ban abortion. Of course, there are some women who might do it illegally, and of course, if you do it illegally, that's more unsafe. So that's why some people will say, well, I don't like abortion, but if we keep it legal, then at least people would do it in a safer manner, and it would be less riskier for the women, and the women wouldn't die as often, because when there are illegal abortions, that is more dangerous for the health of the woman, it seems. But I would sort of say that, well, if the state shall prohibit very grave immoral crimes, that shouldn't necessarily be contingent upon the consequences of doing so. For instance, the state should prohibit rape, even if in a hypothetical situation, banning rape would by some means or another mean that more rape would take place. Let's say we have this hypothetical situation that actually it would be counterproductive. Still, I think that it should be that the state should prohibit rape, because rape is such a grave evil. And furthermore, of course, you can sort of make the arguments that, well, if you ban abortion, that will by itself make far fewer people take abortions in the first place, because it now becomes riskier, more dangerous, more difficult. So we create a strong incentive for people not to take abortion. And yeah, so I would sort of say that. And now I forgot what I was going to say next, but yes, that are some of my considerations when it comes to this issue. And yes, and of course we have to keep in mind that whether the abortion is safe or unsafe, still 50% of the people involved dies anyways, which is the unborn human being. His life is never safe, whether abortion is legal or illegal. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Yes. You brought up a couple of interesting points, and one of these points is that perhaps as a society, there would be other solutions that would be way better even in the total balance than abortion. And so you mentioned adoption, and I once watched a video on abortion where a doctor talked who practiced a lot of abortions, And he also had a fertility problem in his marriage, and so he tried to adopt a child, and it was just about impossible to find a child to adopt in America because all of the unwanted children were aborted. And so this, of course, makes the whole question even more problematic, because if you have, on the one hand, you have the fact that you, in some sense, you end a human life, even though it is in a very early stage and perhaps very small, but still, yes, there is a human nature that is developing and growing, and you are destroying it. And also, on the other hand, you have families who wish for nothing more than to adopt a child because they can't have children of their own. Then it seems even more perverse to kill this newly forming human life. So perhaps there could really be much, and of course also what you have to, what we haven't talked about so far, but many women, as I've heard, and also my wife has read about this, many women who have an abortion have severe psychological problems afterwards, and they have huge, they blame themselves, they feel horrible. And of course, there are also other ones who don't maybe have these feelings, but this also points to the fact that it's not just any type of medical surgery that you are doing here, but it might actually point to the fact that it is an evil that you are committing here, and that the mother feels that in some sense she should protect her child, and she has failed to do so because she has delivered it to being destroyed. And so perhaps there would really be better solutions for society as a whole, including, of course, the unborn, the potential mother, and maybe even other families who might have a great delight in this new human life. And so this is certainly a good consideration. And I would also agree with your point that the unsafe argument is not an argument really to make morally wrong acts legal. So of course you could say, whatever, if murder were legal, then like, and this is sometimes an argument, like, for example, if you would legalize suicide, like assisted suicide, then people wouldn't jump in front of a train and make a huge, like a very traumatic experience for many people around them. So, or yes, if you could just maybe kill all these homeless people that are living on the street and slowly freezing to death, then they wouldn't suffer so much. But still, we don't make this kind of argument, because we say, no, it's morally wrong to kill another human being, and therefore we don't matter if it's unsafe or not when somebody else tries to do it illegally. That doesn't mean that we will legalize it, of course. So yes, maybe you want to say something to these two points.
Right. Yes. I think you made some good points there, both about the social and psychological consequences of abortion, which might be very grave, and of course it might lead to many different kinds of problems. Not only lesser problems, like for instance that abortion incentivizes people to be less careful about their sexuality, or that abortion undermines family in society and all that. So we have also these social consequences, and also as you said, that's very interesting. I didn't know that you actually see that there are very few children, relatively speaking, who are ready to be adopted, because there are so many who are killed in abortion. So that's of course a sad thing to hear, indeed. And also from a traditional Catholic perspective, there is actually another consequence is very grave as well when it comes to abortion. Of course, this is from a Catholic perspective, so this is not necessarily an argument that atheists might accept, but there is a traditional Catholic perspective that if you kill unborn people in abortion, then they would not get to heaven because they haven't received the sacrament of baptism. They would go to a place called limbo, which is actually a sort of nice place, but it's not heaven. So we actually deprive them of eternal life in heaven with God, and that's also a huge cost of abortion as well, from a Catholic perspective, of course. If you accept the traditional Catholic perspective. Now, there are some Catholics today who argue that no, even aborted babies can get to heaven, but that's a debate for another discussion, perhaps. But yes, also from a religious standpoint, you might say that there are costs there as well. But yes, regardless of that, when it comes to religion, of course, both atheists and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists all can agree that it is wrong to take an innocent human being's life, and since abortion does that, abortion is a gravely evil matter. Because some people say, oh, you are against abortion simply because you are religious, but that's not true at all, because you can agree that abortion is murder regardless of what you think of God and Christianity and all that. So yes, that's also something I would say.
Yes, so to my mind, there is just one more really important question that I have brought it up once or twice, but we haven't really discussed it yet. And I think it's very difficult. And of course, the feminists would already be screaming at us because we are here talking about women's body, two men talking about the body of a woman and what she can and cannot do with it. But I think this is actually an important problem, because we say we have the sanctity of human life, and a cell after conception is a human being with its own human nature and its own form and soul and everything. But then on the other hand, you have another human being, which is actually quite a lot bigger, and this is the woman inside whom this child is growing now. I think it's philosophically, it's a difficult question if this woman has the right to say, hey, this is my body. I don't want this child growing inside of my body, and so it's my right to take it out. And you, as someone who, it's not your body, it's my body, and so you don't have anything to say about it. So what do you think of this?
Right, yeah, so yeah, there are several things I would say that first, of course, this feminist attack that, oh, but you are male people, you should listen to women when it comes to abortion. I find that argument very unconvincing, because of course arguments are completely independent upon who is making them. It is completely irrelevant whether we are men and women with regards to the arguments about when does human life begin, etc., because those are philosophical and scientific questions, have nothing to do with whether the person arguing for that or against that is male or female. So yes, and yes, it seems to be a very a normal liberal premise that people have the right to do whatever they want with their own bodies. Now, I would reject that liberal premise and say that no, actually, our human bodies has an inherent dignity that we cannot simply abuse and attack and destroy in whatever way we want to. That we actually have certain moral obligations to take care of ourselves and treat ourselves in a morally good manner. So you could sort of say that that our bodies are not simply our property, but we sort of are stewards to take care of our own body, to protect its dignity, to protect its sanctity, and not simply abuse it and misuse it. So I will sort of reject the liberal premise. But even if you accept the liberal premise that yes, people have the right to control their own property however they want, well, yes, okay. If you believe that you could perhaps justify a sort of a process, I'm not sure if the process is possible to do yet, but perhaps it will be in the future. I don't remember the name, but it is a process where you can take out the embryo from the mother's womb, not killing it, but simply taking it out and placing it in some artificial thing or another mother's womb or something like that, perhaps. So you don't kill it, you simply move it away from the mother's womb and someplace else where it can grow and become a mature human being, a full-grown human being. So that might justify that, but it cannot justify killing a human being just because it is inside your own body, because that human being is a human being from conception onward. So it is not longer a part of your body. It is something in and of itself. Yes, it is inside your body, but that doesn't mean that it is a part of your body. So that's, of course, an important distinction I would make. So what do you think of these considerations?
Yes. So the first point that you made, I absolutely agree. Of course, men and women can talk about and should talk about moral questions, and your own gender has nothing to do with the quality of your argument. So that's very important. Now, what I think what it comes down to here is this conflict between the right to life of a human and the right to bodily integrity of a human, or to control of one's own body. This is very difficult because these are both very fundamental rights, I think. I mean, there is the right to life, liberty, property, but I would place the right to bodily integrity actually on the same level as the right to life, because if someone comes and cuts off my foot, then this is one of the worst kinds of intrusion into me as a person that is possible. So both the right to life and the right to control of one's own body is absolutely essential. Now, I see your point that maybe it's not correct, the liberal premise that you have the right to do with your body whatever you want, but there is a certain human nature and a certain natural order that dictates certain ways that you should or should not treat your body, and therefore it can be immoral to do certain things with your body. And I even tend to agree with this notion, but I think still that this is a different question than the question, is now society allowed to enforce certain ways of using one's own body or not? Because as soon as someone else has the right to enforce what I do with my own body, then they can enforce their own prejudice and maybe strange and ideas onto me that I would not agree with. And maybe I would say, no, human nature means something completely different. So then it comes down to who has the right to interpret this. And so even if we accept this idea that you are not the owner of your body, but the steward in some sense, for me, it still doesn't follow that society now has a right to impose any kind of things that I can or cannot do with my body. It's a difficult question, maybe also for another time. Yes, and as you said, if you could in some procedure take the baby out of the woman's body, then of course that would be the moral thing to do. Then you wouldn't have to end a human life, and the woman could get back the control over her body. Though actually I would want to talk more about this idea as well, because it has a lot of difficulties, but I think we are nearing the time limit for our video, so perhaps we can keep this as an open end for future discussion. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. I think we sort of brought up some interesting topics right here at the end, as you mentioned, the right to bodily integrity, the right to sort of abuse or the right to use your body as you please, as opposed to what should the state legislate. This is a topic that we have touched upon earlier, but of course it's something we can return to, and who has the competence to legislate based on and conception of the natural law, all of that. And yes, I think these are relevant questions, and also this process or procedure, as mentioned. I can't remember the name of that, but I heard about it from a libertarian scholar, actually, Walter Block, who has argued this solution to the abortion problem. But yes, I would, of course, sort of conclude that I would say that abortion is the unlawful taking of an innocent human being's life, and that therefore it should be prohibited without any exceptions, because it is murder. And of course, mothers who are in a tough and difficult situation, they should be treated with compassion, but still we cannot justify tough situations, or we cannot justify abortion simply on tough situations. So that's what I would say to that. And yes, so that would sort of be my concluding remarks on abortion, and of course the question of bodily integrity and all of that. I sort of stated my idea about you having sort of an obligation to protect your own dignity, that you cannot simply use your body however you want, and that actually the state can legislate what you can do and not do to a certain degree. So to summarize it very briefly. So yes, that is my final, I suppose, comments on this topic, or these topics. So yes, I will say thank you very much, Amos, for having me on and discussing these topics. And I wish you a great day, as well as the audience.
Thank you very much for coming here. And yes, please, if someone in the audience feels offended or has a very differing opinion, or the same opinion as we expressed, then please write it in the comments, and maybe we can make a follow-up video where we can go into more of the details where we stopped this one. So thank you for coming on. It was interesting as always, and I will see you all some other time. Bye-bye.
Bye.